So welcome all, and a special warm welcome to our presenters today. We have a fascinating paper that we get presented, and then we can also discuss. And welcome Marco De Simoni and Antonio Pellegrini from the Banca d'Italia Italian Financial Intelligence Unit. So the specialists also in the field that have conducted this study that they're going to talk about and that we've already addressed in our invitation, with the title that you both have to explain maybe to the viewers a bit. What's this all about? It's a very fancy title of Not a Dog, Not a Wolf. All he knows is what he's not. And we are very interested to hear more about the title and also more about the content of this paper, which is really fascinating because it sheds light on the structure of money laundering, and something that is always a bit difficult to investigate and also to research. And I'm very curious to hear more about it. It's about the structure, especially with buffer companies that are somewhat a buffer between some shell companies and the real companies in the whole scheme of money laundering. And I'm really happy to hear more about it. Just for your information before we start, and I leave the floor to Marco De Simoni and Antonio Pellegrini, the webinar will be recorded, so it will be, you will be able to watch it afterwards, but there will be a recording going on. But I don't want to go more into the detail and leave the floor up to our both speakers. Just for the organization of the webinar today, we won't have a discussant. So there will be the presentation. You will have enough time to present the paper, which is quite complex also, with all the questions you've been able to answer. So we have around 25 minutes of presentation. So I would suggest then to wrap it up at around 5:30 p.m. Italian Swiss Dutch time. And then that leaves the floor open for questions from the audience. But without further ado, welcome again to both of our speakers, and thank you very much for being here. We're very honored, and we are very interested to hear more about your research.
So thank you very much. Let me share my screen. So Antonio, we start presenting, and we got technical problems.
As usual.
Okay, let me switch the presentation. Okay, I hope you see the presentation.
You see it?
Yes.
Okay, you see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good evening. I'm Antonio Pellegrini, and I'm an ST analyst at the Financial Intelligence Unit for Italy. And I'm going to spend 2 words about our title. Not a dog, not a wolf, always knowing what is not. This came from a Balto cartoon and of 1995, and it sums up our result about buffer company, because we think that buffer company are amphibious in nature. They share some characteristic with the shell companies, which are the fraud in the fiscal fraud, and some characteristic with the real operative companies, which are the dogs in the fiscal fraud. So now I'm going to present you the introduction, literature, and motivation, and our expectation about the buffer company. Then Marco will show you statistical analysis, first the buffer company's red flag, and our indicator. Then want to flag this kind of comp. So let's go. Fiscal fraud. You know that fiscal fraud is a predicate offense of money laundering. Very important fiscal fraud is a VAT fraud. And in this kind of fraud, we usually find this kind of companies. Shell companies are also called paper mill or missing trader, and are a company that issues false invoices, and they don't have tangible assets, but they have a very high turnover. Then we have real operative companies that benefit from the this VAT fraud, these frauds like VAT fraud, that they have false VAT credit. And then we find buffer companies. About buffer companies in literature, we only find some few qualitative studies that describe the role of buffer companies. They are in the middle between the real operative companies and the shell companies with the aim to enlarge the fraudulent chain and make the detection of the fraud harder. We sometimes find that buffer company can be large company like joint stock companies. And sometimes we find that the buffer companies can be unaware about the fraud because it is made by the middle management. So we don't find anything about the quantitative studies about buffer companies. So the aim of our work is to answer to these two research questions. What are the characteristics of buffer companies from a financial statement point of view? And based on this characteristic, can we build a first composite indicator that flags buffer companies among financial intermediaries customer base? We think that these are our motivation. We think this is very important for financial intermediaries and for other subject obliged entities in order to identify and possible to report buffer companies to Financial Intelligence Unit of Italy as soon as possible, in order to mitigate reputational risk and reputational risk and financial risk. These two risks are very important in this ESG context that we are living now. Eventually, we wanted to encourage new studies on buffer companies, which are not very studied until. So this is a graph. In this graph, it comes from our fiscal law enforcement agency, as named Guardia di Finanza, and it describes the role of buffer company. Buffer company is in the middle between shell companies and the real operative companies in order to enlarge the fraudulent chain. But we have to focus on these points. Buffer companies play the same job of shell company, the wolf of in our title, because it issue and receive false invoices with similar prices, and issued and received invoices that are cashed in and paid immediately. These 2 points are very important for our study. And moreover, buffer company looks like a rock real operative company from a structural point of view, with assets, with employees. So these 3 points are very important for us. And this table sums up all of this consideration, our expectation about the financial statement of buffer companies. First of all, we know that, in our opinion, the revenues and the purchases of buffer companies are greater than shell companies and real operative companies, because buffer companies have 2 sources, legal and illegal, while the shell company only illegal and the real operative company only legal. The assets, we imagine that the assets of buffer companies are greater than shell companies, because we find in literature that buffer company can be a joint stock company, and in Italian there aren't any other greater legal form of SPA, of joint stock company, while the shell company are very often limited companies or individual business. But about real operative companies, we can say anything. We say that can be or greater or equal to real operative company asset. But it's from this point, this 1, 2, 3, from 1 minus P over R and to the outstanding working capital cycle and working capital ratio, we have to focus on this point. It issue and receive false invoices with similar prices. So we imagine that the value 1 minus P over R is very low, is near to 0, close to 0, like shell company, while it is smaller than real operative companies, because real operative companies are profitable firms that in which the prices are revenues. And the other point is that they issued and received invoices that are cashed and paid immediately. And this should reduce the outstanding working capital cycle and working capital ratio, which should be lesser than in real operative companies. Moreover, in the end, we write that buffer companies looks like a rock from a structural point of view. So in order to separate the buffer companies to shell companies, we used to study the bank debt, the central register, centrale di rischi in Italy. Because shell companies don't rely on bank channel, while buffer companies rely on bank channel, but with a slightly different with the real operative companies. In fact, from a long-term point of view, we think that they are similar because they have to finance the tangible asset. The difference is in the short-term point of view. In fact, we imagine that buffer companies rely lesser in the short-term point of view for two reasons. First, because they have a shorter working capital cycle. And second, because they don't want that their false invoices are supervised by bank. And this can be a relevant and harmful advantage for buffer companies because they can save interest and commission from banks. The last point is that while shell companies are created for the purpose of the fraud, they act illegally They always act illegally. A company may take part of the criminal network only for a limited period of time. So we imagine that after the fraud, there is a regression to the normal behaving of a real operative company. These are our expectations about buffer company.
Yeah, so after this theory that Antonio depicted, I will provide some ground to this theory. And so the first thing we need is a sample of buffer companies. And so what we have done to fill this sample, where we read all the sentences from the Italian Supreme Court, the Cassazione, which is the highest degree of appeal. And it is the only one to publish its sentences. And so we basically selected all the sentences that contain keywords that are linked to buffer companies, which is the name buffer and other Italian names that refer to this phenomenon from 2018 to 2023. And we read all of them. There were about 100 sentences. And we read them carefully because we wanted to. The sentences are discursive, and there is the description of the offense, and we try to understand which is the firm that acted as a buffer, and we also try to understand in which year, because the sentences are related to a specific year in which the fraud went on, and so we extrapolate from these sentences dataset the name of the buffer company and the year in which they have acted illegally. Since this is the highest court, we are pretty sure that they acted fraudulently, because I think after 3 degrees of sentences. And then we did the same job with our suspicion transaction reports database. We selected all the STRs with words linked to BC, and we read all of them in a larger period for 2 main reasons. The first one is that there are very, very few STRs which describe a buffer company. So this is also one of the motivations of our work, to raise awareness about this type of fraud and also the different actors that may take part, because nowadays I think there were like 15 STRs which identify a buffer company in a 10-year span, so very, very few. So in the end, we end up with a sample of 39 buffer company, which have reported at least one financial statement. Since we want to rely on financial statement, we only keep the ones that have reported at least one financial statement in the last 20 years. So, what are the characteristics? I will describe them briefly. Most of them are limited liabilities. There is a quite, I mean, we are talking about small sample, but like for buffer companies, are joint stock companies. So there is which is, I mean, in percentage is a high percentage. And then they are active, as you may expect, in the wholesale sector, which is, I mean, understandable because of the nature of the fraud, but that is easier to be put in place in this type of sector. And of course, they are different from the universe of the Italian firms because they are larger, as Antonio said before, and also the legal type, because they are most limited liabilities and with a small but significant minority of joint stock companies. And so we need to select an appropriate control group. So we use this approach, which is called propensity score matching. So we assign a score to each Italian firm, and we keep the one that are more similar to the buffer company, except for the fact that we believe that they have not acted as buffer company. So we select on structural characteristics such as sector, legal type, size, and age, and date of birth. And then we compare these two samples. We run several regressions to understand in which dimension they are different. And this slide will present the main results. As you can see, in line with the theory, buffer companies are larger in terms of revenues. They have larger revenues, but with a worse combination of, let me say, production factor. Capitals, which can be proxy by asset, is similar to other companies, while labor is smaller. So, and this leads to a very higher productivity measured in revenues per capita, but not in profitability, because we don't have significant results in profitability. And days of payment are shorter among all the dimension we are interested in. So they pay in fewer days than the average of Italian firms, and they are paid in fewer days than the average of Italian firms. A brief, I think, just I want the days of payment of the Italian firms are among the slowest in Europe. Usually invoices are paid after 2 or 3 months. And this type of firm are very fast in paying and being paid. And this, of course, all this leads to a fast working capital cycle, which is lower than the average of Italian companies. And the last thing I want to highlight is that the purchases over revenues ratio is higher, and that tends to be closer to 1. Because, of course, purchases are very close to revenues. And as Antonio said, there are another type of companies, which are the shell companies. And we have a sample of shell companies, which was built by Antonio, and with the same methodology, so reading the sentences of the Supreme Court. And is a sample of 30 firms, and we did a comparison, a t-test comparison among these two samples, and we noticed that they are similar in some aspect to buffer companies, because they have a similar working capital rate, which is lower than the average of Italian companies, and but there are also many differences. They have production factors because they have more employees and more assets, and they also have higher productivity, like with respect to other type of company. Another thing that I want to highlight is that we merge our data set of buffer companies, shell companies, and the sample of control group to the credit registry. Credit registry is a data set of the Bank of Italy that summarize the loans to firms in Italy, and all loans above 30,000 euro are registered in this dataset. And we noticed that buffer companies are present in this dataset in 70% of cases, which is in line with our sample of control group, but this is more than double the percentage of shell companies. So for shell companies, our paper mills are empty, are just basically, let me say, are just the financial statements. They are not even not real activity, so they don't need to rely on the banking channel. Also, they want to avoid banking scrutiny, and so they stay away from loans and whatever. While buffer companies have an hybrid nature, and so they have to rely on the banking channel, especially in a country like Italy, which is bank-centric, and firms rely a lot on banks for funding, for financing their activity. So the first goal of our work has been partially achieved, let me say that, because we highlight that the buffer companies, at least the sample of buffer company we selected, present several interesting differences, both with respect to real operating companies and both with respect to shell companies. But we want to provide some, I don't know, I can say guidance to practitioners in the ML field, and we want to try to build a preliminary indicator for the detection of buffer companies, and we call it a buffer company composite indicator, BCCI. And so we, after many brainstorming, we came up with this idea. And so we built a logistic regression where we have on the left-hand side, we have a categorical variable that takes value 1 if the firm is a buffer company and 0 otherwise. And then we choose from our empirical analysis 4 predictors, which are let me call it adjusted value added, which is 1 minus purchases over revenues, the working capital rate, 1 minus the fact that you are present in the credit registry, and the productivity, so the revenues per capita. Why do we choose these variables? Well, one can say that we can just put all the financial statement variable in this logistic model and then draw our results and whatever. But we want something that is operative, that is workable, that guys of the ML function of the bank can use. And so we need to use just 3, 4, 5 variables, so that is an easy to use indicator. And so we select this 4 variable based on our theory. And so we run this logistic regression and we obtain the coefficients on the table that you see in these slides. And then for each cut point of the logistic regression, which are represented here in the ROC curve, we choose the one that is linked to a sensitivity of 75%. So we are correctly identifying 3/4 of our buffer companies. And on that threshold, which is a sort of flat line, we choose the one that maximizes specificity. And so we reach a combination of 75% sensitivity and like 70% specificity. And so the cut point related to this point is minus 2.2. So we put the coefficients of the logistic regression into the equation, and we came up with the rule. And this rule is a preliminary operative rule to discriminate firms that you think that may take a part in a fraud, and you say, okay, let's see if we are in presence of a buffer company. We can apply this rule, and if the result of this equation is higher than minus 2.1, we are possibly dealing with the BC. Otherwise, maybe this is not a buffer companies. And so I think I can conclude, and I think I'm on time. So 3 main conclusions of our work. First of all, this is there are many work on this subject, but not of this type. I think, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first one that try to understand the financial statements of buffer companies and to try to build a rule that allow to identify buffer companies. And of course, this rule cannot be used alone. It has to be used also with other red flags like the days, payment days and whatever, and also the knowledge of the AML function that knows, given their knowledge of the customer, the business and whatever, when they have a suspect, they can apply this rule. And another outcome of this work, raising awareness. As I shown before, there are very, very few STRs that identify buffer companies. And fiscal fraud are a complex phenomena, but there are different actors. And we reckon that identifying the role of each actor is very important to address this problem. And I think that with this, we are done. And so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really interesting talk, and for being like Swiss on time, I'd say. That's incredible. Really on the minute. So the Swiss is very happy. I leave the floor to questions that are in the audience. I don't want to keep you guys from having questions. I can see that there are probably a few. And yeah, we have one for Kilian Wegner. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that really interesting paper. I have just one short question on the selection of buffer companies that you choose for your data set. Did you discriminate whether those buffer companies that you chose from the data were ones that were taking part knowingly in a VAT fraud scheme, or were there also companies that were part without knowing that they were part of the scheme? And if you did not discriminate, do you think you would have better data if you would discriminate, or do you think it doesn't matter?
Yeah, no, actually, we didn't discriminate on this aspect, but this is a very interesting question and a very interesting point, because there is judicial evidence of buffer companies that have acted this way because of some manager, and the shareholder, the owners, didn't know about this, especially very large companies. But in our sentences, the sentence usually wasn't about the buffer company. The buffer company wasn't incriminated in the sentence usually. The incriminated were the reoperating company.
And short companies.
Short company, yeah. In the sentence, there is a generic line that say also alpha firms acted as in this fraud as a shell company, as a buffer company. So we weren't able to extrapolate this information from the sentences we read.
Okay, thanks. Michele, I think you had a question.
Yeah, no, thanks. No, thank you indeed for participating in this webinar today. I think it was very, very useful and interesting. Two questions. So the first is, have you detected other characteristics beyond the financial statements which could lead to detection of these firms, like in terms of territorial distribution within Italy and also outside Italy, or in terms of governance and ownership patterns? Did you detect differences, or do you have at least hypotheses based on the evidence? This is the first question. The second is more practically oriented, and I understand that basically you assume that an AML department of a bank, by applying this indicator, could better detect buffer companies. Okay, let's imagine that they do the job, so they apply it and they detect buffer companies. Practically speaking, what then they have to do do the rest? Meaning, how can they identify the other firms? How can they reconstruct the fiscal fraud? So can you somehow explain what you would expect from a good and compliant bank to do the job?
Yeah, on the first part, from a geographical point of view, we didn't see any pattern. So there was I mean, there are not many firms, but they were quite spread all around Italy. There were not, let me say, no usual, I don't know, south concentration that happens always when you deal with Italy, or north-south divide, nothing of that kind. And they were quite related to I mean, of course, there were firms from Milan because a lot of firms in Milan, so nothing specific. And we didn't match this data set with owners or managers, so we didn't exploit that part. And
for the second questions about the predictional applications. So we imagine that if an email function of a financial intermediaries or a subject of large entities identify this buffer company using our buffer companies indicator, it has to study its bank account to find out if there are, for example, shell companies, because buffer companies work every time with shell companies. So in order to detect shell companies, they can be used other methods. In Bank of Italy we published it once in 220 in order to detect shell companies, or it's useful to study and use our red flags that have been published from Bank of Italy to they call the fiscal fraud pattern. On November 2020, we published a lot of red flags about fiscal fraud in Italy. So it's important, very, very important to study together buffer companies and shell companies, because shell companies are in the middle and in a fraudulent chain. They don't operate by themselves.
You also can look at invoices.
Yes, you can see, for example, if the bank account, the wire transfer are of round amounts, for example, or with generic codes, like in Italy we say acconto fattura, pagamento fattura, without number and date, for example. There are a lot of red flags. For example, I wanted to point out that we say that the invoices issued and received are paid in immediately, without any delay. So Bank of Italy in 2020 published a red flag in which and we report in our paper. I'm going to search it because it is in our paper, and Financial Intelligence for Italy wrote systematic coincidence of the invoice settlement and issue date. So this point is very important, because if the invoice is issued today and is paid today or tomorrow, is a great red flag. And this reduce credit, debit, and stocks, because stocks. So this and the reduction of this point reduce day outstanding and working capital ratio.
Thank you. We have another question from Simone Pintus.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Congratulations for this analysis. But looking for the future, how do you think that AMLA will help this kind of analysis? I think, for example, to FIU network, or maybe in consideration with the European Anti-Fraud Officer. Do you think that we are in the good way to put in common all these studies? Thank you.
I think that it is very useful in VAT fraud, And in VAT fraud, it's a problem of Europe, a very great problem, issue for Europe. You know that there is a DIEPO, I don't know, I don't know. In Italy, we call the EPO is the office,
European prosecutor.
the European prosecutor about VAT fraud, and it's a very great issue for Europe. So we think that it can be used to detect fiscal European fraud.
Yeah, I don't remember the percentage of
Okay.
investigations by the European prosecutor, but a large part of them is related to value-added tax frauds. And also the estimate of the amount of the frauds is like in billion terms. So it's a very European problem. So because the fact that the European law on VAT also is easily exploitable by criminals. And so I think that's an issue that AMLA should take on.
Yeah, Kilian Wegner.
Another question that came to my mind is whether your method, why only use it in the private sector, not use it as a tax authority? Because I think the tax authority, they have data points that could make your method even more powerful. For example, they can see, I don't know, how much storage space a company has, and I think that would be maybe a good risk indicator to see how many storage space these people have as expenses in their tax declaration versus how many volume of goods they are trading. It's probably a strange ratio. They also see more granularly the profits, not only on the aggregated level in the company report that you use, but they see it, on an invoice based on a monthly base. So maybe if you take all your companies that you found that you have in the data set and you give it to tax authorities and tell them you have more data on them, use your data, and then maybe you have really powerful risk indicators for the internal stateside VAT fraud prevention.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And let me add a few things because they have the data, because we rely on financial statements, so only on limited liabilities companies, because in Italy, limited liabilities companies are obliged to deposit their financial statement each year. But the tax authority is also the sort of the simplified financial statement of individual firms and of a partnership. And so we will also increase our sample of firms. And the data set they have is the electronic invoice data set, which is like, I think to my mind is the most useful data set for this type of fraud, because you can use the invoice and then you can forget about financial statement, whatever, and just to see if the invoice, if you find some patterns in the invoices, and then you can. But unfortunately, we don't have access to those data. But a very interesting point. Yeah.
Yes, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great project. So a couple of questions. One's to follow up on Michele's on the geographical distribution of this. And you said there wasn't really noticeable patterns within Italy, but I'm wondering, and maybe Michele was also wondering about patterns, if there are linkages internationally, or if this is all really what you found are sort of largely contained within Italy. So that's sort of question number one. The second, as I'm just wondering, like, you sort of describe it as one shell company, one buffer company, and one rock, right? And I'm wondering if there's some notion of multiple shell companies, like what sort of pattern, multiple buffer companies. Because if you're going to extend the chain, then obviously you can do that pretty easily, I would think, by adding additional buffer companies. And so if there's anything about that. And then the third question is sort of the more fundamental question, which is, I think it sounded like you were surprised a little bit at the low number of buffer companies that turned up to this method, which I was too. So I'm wondering, that points to like how representative these are and this consistent problem in this field. And so I'm acknowledging that it's across the field of how do we know there's reason to think that the people get caught are not typical, right? There's something unusual about them by the very fact that they got caught. And so what if what we're seeing here, what you're picking up on are in fact the sort of the ones that just aren't very good criminals, basically, right? And so they're not representative of the broader population of buffer companies that are out there. So how do we think about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can start from the last point, which is of course, I mean, a serious issue. Let me add that also another potential issue is the fact that we are, since the STR's contribution is very low, we are picking films from the last appeal. So to go to the last appeal, you have to go resources and whatever, and you want to fight. So of course, while most of the tax cases you settle at the beginning, okay, I give you a percentage of what I owe you and it's over. So of course, these there are many factors that affect our data set and potentially also our results. We try to control for this by selecting an appropriate control group, so films that are very similar. And so our hope, our guess is that since we are controlling on dimension, on age, sector, whatever, we are controlling from this factor, and what is residual is explained by the fraud. But of course, I mean, this is we can improve on this. Then the first point, we didn't have, of course, we don't have many data. We should see the list of shareholders, mergers, if there are some patterns with the foreign owners or whatever, but we don't have data on let's say foreign trade, so we don't know their foreign exposure. And on the second point, I think is up to you. The second point was about the second question was about the Mark.
Buffer company, the number of buffer companies and how many, you know,
Yes,
just
chain.
one.
Okay.
Sure.
Yes.
How many links in the chain do we see?
There is no correct answer to this one because we propose a very the enforcement agency Guardia di Finanza show a very simple mechanism, and we usually find this kind of mechanism but multiplied a lot of times. So it's you can find a lot of buffer companies and a lot of shell companies too. And sometimes it became very, very difficult to understand the point, to understand where the fraudulent chain begins and where the fraudulent chain ends, because it's very, so it's a great problem. But we think that we have to find I don't know to say. We want to find a weak point of this fraudulent chain. For example, using our buffer companies indicator, because if we find just one of these companies, we can find all the chain. So. Or if we find only shell companies, because there is a composite indicator for shell companies too, we find all the chain. For example, it's very important to study using the graph analysis. The graph analysis in this case is very useful, but we only need to find one point to discover all the point of the fraudulent chain, because we can follow the money. At Financial Intelligence Unit, we make this job. We follow the money. If we find, for example, one shell company, we can follow the money from to buffer companies to real operative companies and so on. I hope to have answered to this question or your question.
Thank you. If I can jump in real quickly, I was also wondering what Mark was asking about the external validity, so how to maybe extrapolate your findings to other European countries, whether that is some sort of a scheme that might be used in other countries as well. That would be interesting to have a comparative maybe approach to that. And your results, you show that there are really like strong red flags. Do you intend to maybe try and make it like institutionalize or make a program out of it, or like a warning system maybe for FIUs or for banks or for compliance professionals, or as was suggested maybe for tax offices to maybe use these red flags a bit systematically? Or is there any kind of development that you can see in for your results?
I think that we are quite confident in our work, so I think we have arrived at a good point of, and of course, one thing we need to do is to try to present this project, because also to enforcement, and we want to present it to the Italian financial police, and we want to present it also to the tax authority. And this, of course, will get valuable feedback. And of course, I think given and the other thing we want to do is also try to increase our sample to make it more varied and to keep more aspect of this fraud and whatever. But I think this is like the first job on this. So because the other jobs were related also were or descriptive, or they try to synthesize some judicial cases, and
qualitative studies.
They were qualitative in nature, and we use them a lot because they are the backbone of our study. But we try to give to this literature some a bit of empirical foundation. And so yes, of course, we want to talk the more we can about this work, and also to get feedback, and also maybe to get more data to improve it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or test it within the sample whether or not the red flags are working. That would be interesting.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then maybe have some of us tested in our countries to see whether this is working there as well. I'm not aware of the different schemes in Switzerland, but I can imagine from at least the cases that I've seen that there are these different layers of companies, and detour is quite popular in Switzerland as well when it comes to tax fraud. So I could imagine that this is more of a general way of dealing with these types of crimes. Okay, are there any other questions that can be addressed? If not, you have already a bit anticipated another question I wanted to ask is what comes next? So what are your next steps in regard to this research? You said that you would want to maybe expand the sample since the number of your buffer companies is still quite low. Are there any next steps that you intend on developing based on your findings?
Well, no, the first step, we want to publish this work on our working paper series of the FIU, which is called the Quaderni of the Anti-Riciclaggio, the Anti-Money Laundering Studies, yes. And so this is a working paper series which is read by stakeholders like AML function of banks, financial intermediaries, and so on. And so this will raise awareness, and maybe from this awareness we can get the data we want, maybe from the STR side. And so this is the first next interest step. And then, yes, of course, we want to get in touch with the financial police and tax authorities, and maybe also with some European colleagues.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Joras? Yeah.
So yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation, and I understand why you would go for logistic regression, because the dependent variable is very much 0, 1. But you could also consider other methods to look at this classifier idea of saying whether a company fits in this group of buffer companies or not, like Bayesian classifier, but there's of course many other methods as well. Have you tried any other methods besides logistic regression? And to what extent were the results better or worse?
Yeah, I tried a simple classification tree. It didn't work very well. And I also tried linear discriminant analysis, but logistic regression performs better. Yeah, and it's also quite the also advantage of logistic regression is that we can derive the rule that can be implemented. So it's very practical.
Yes,
So
indeed.
this-
I think there are many, especially machine learning kind of models that might get much better results, but might have much less of explainability. That's the big advantage of logistic regression. You could really see which of these factors have been contributing to the score, which makes it much more insightful in terms of red flags, indeed.
I want to point out just one thing, that we hope new studies about buffer companies. We encourage new studies about buffer companies because we think that we find few data because there aren't any studies about this point. So we hope that in the future will be a lot of studies about this, and in order to detect more companies.
Well, maybe on that aspect, I think the main limitation for researchers on this topic is the data availability, which you've also been challenged by. To what extent is the data you use available for other researchers?
Well, I think the sentences are on the website of the Supreme Court. And I think the financial statement variables can be found because there are several providers that make them available. And the only thing that is not available is the credit registry, which is the amount of bank loans firms have, which is this is just of the Bank of Italy. So
it's private.
It's private.
And the information about the control group?
They are public, and I think there are I think they are available also from other. Yeah, the point is that they are public. If you go to the there is a real place where firms have to register and whatever. Not the Camera di Commercio. The Chamber of Commerce. If you go to the Chamber of Commerce, you can take the data on a particular firm, or you can do it online and you can. And the point is that they have this provider, they make them available like in big data, and of course the service is by the I think in Orbis
AIDA, maybe.
AIDA, yes.
AIDA.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's mostly about labeling which ones are the buffer companies. I think that's the main limitation.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Livio Russo.
Sorry. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this very interesting meeting. I have a question, because these data are available in this massive way, more than rely on the private sector. This is something that really should be easy for the public sector to assess this data to identify the most really risky company. So I think that really it is a partnership that can be done between different type of public sector bodies in order to really start investigation. I don't know if I was clear or.
Yeah, are you suggesting to build a partnership among public authorities to put together data and to improve this detection and to the main problem is I think that the main, which is understandable because the tax authority data are very confidential in nature, so there are privacy, confidentiality concerns, and so they, even if we are a financial intelligence unit, there are some understandable issues in sharing this type of data because they are related to people, and so this is there are this type of obstacles that we say this, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on.
Depending
your
on
point of view.
on the legal view, but that's probably a problem for everybody. Data protection issue.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, if there aren't any other last question, you all make me very happy by being very punctual because we are getting at the end of our hour, and therefore thank you very much for the two presenters, Mark and Antonio, for your really interesting work, and we hope to hear more from you and your work here soon, and hope we can read you soon as well. Thanks for everybody else to have joined this webinar today, and we look forward to having you back in a month. I think it's the next webinar that Mark is organizing, I guess. Great, so we look forward to that, and thank you all for being here, and have a very nice evening.